everyone. I'm Julia Rollins. I'm on our client success team at Dealroom, and I'm here to introduce Managing M&A Sourcing, Diligence, and Integration, a discussion on best practices and tips. This session features Aaron Whiting, Director of Strategic Programs at ContinuumCloud, and Sabeeh Khan, Director of Corporate Strategy and Development at Syniti. M&A scientist Kison Patel will also be moderating this discussion.
This podcast is sponsored by S&P Capital IQ Pro. There's nothing more critical than having the most up-to-date and accurate data on private companies. And unfortunately, this tends to be the most difficult data to source. Well, not anymore. The team at S&P has been rapidly expanding its private company data coverage to provide a more comprehensive and robust data set. Access deeper private company coverage, advanced visualizations, proprietary reports, you name it. It's all there on a single web-based platform, so you have all the resources you need to create a winning pitch. Learn more about S&P Capital IQ Pro at spglobal.com/MA Science. Again, that's spglobal.com/MA Science. You guys pumped up for this conversation?
I didn't realize we were in the way of happy hour. I think you did that to me last time too.
We did that to you last time. Look what I got. We just literally came today in the mail, but we got copies of our next book we're publishing. It's only 48 pages. So that's a big achievement. We're going to get more into that after this session. Hey, you ready to kick things off?
Yeah. I got my start with a software company going back to, 2014. I got my first taste of M&A and integration as a functional lead. So I tried to experience integration from any angle in the company that I could possibly get my hands on. A lot of that was client care focus, so support services, but really just jumping in wherever I possibly could. Maybe 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, I moved to a fintech company and started leading the integrations there. And that's when I really got hooked. I led, we'll call it between somewhere in the middle of 10 and 15 there, depending on how we're to measure. And then have recently moved to ContinuumCloud, as you mentioned, Kison, in a strategic programs role. Which is, if you've never tried it, one of the coolest jobs you can possibly do. I came on to run the initial merger for two great companies that were coming together under that ContinuumCloud heading. So I've been running that, but also strategic programs allows me a little bit more bandwidth to get into areas that maybe best practices either weren't there or didn't match. So it gives me the opportunity to help those functions build up into a kind of a standard that we can then integrate into later. So that's my M&A background. I drift as far back into the deal side as I possibly can, but am definitely a post-close guy. So I need guys like Sabeeh on the other side of the coin there.
Well, you want to kick things off with maybe talking a little bit about your process in terms of process must-haves and what do you bend on?
I think, so let me put a placeholder up for Sabeeh and then we can kind of go backwards a little bit. I was lucky enough to catch some of Chris's last bit there. And I love the slide with 5 bars there all around alignment. And it's an area that when we think about things like the knowledge chasm, right, or the alignment gap that can be created, that's critical. So that's when we talk about critical process, that's one that I draw a huge circle around, is getting that alignment pre-close. I don't claim that is an easy thing to do. I would claim that it's easier to do than some make it appear. But I do think you need a great partner on the other side, like a Sabeeh or another corp dev guy to really help set you up for success there. If we think about where integration would typically overlap most heavily with the corp dev side pre-close, it's really, I'm there pre-diligence and LOI, and I pick up heavy during diligence. But really, as we come out of diligence, the formal diligence, that's when I'm really kind of picking up speed, and we're starting to shift from a Sabeeh handling that relationship to me. So that's really where I need that good handoff to come from. So without a proper setup, I'm toast. So with a proper setup coming out of diligence, it frees me up to have those alignment conversations that I think Chris was getting to there. It's difficult, and I'm glad to have guys like Sabeeh on the other side who can start setting up those relationships and be as transparent as possible. There are some instances where some of that is a little bit more difficult, depending on what the thesis is, et cetera. But getting to clarity pre-close is absolutely critical because everything rolls off of that. So setting up some of those meetings where it almost feels too scripted, right? Sitting down and really walking through, okay, here's what the next 100 days look like. Here's what we've done to date, right? Here's the plan, really mapping out. I think Chris called it a roadmap, but it's really just what are the big milestones? What's it going to feel like? How are we going to handle the staff that are there already? What's the communication plan going to be? And getting that too clear, right? Over striving for clarity and making sure don't assume that everybody understands what this is going to be like. It may be their first time through and they've got preconceived notions about how long this takes, right? Are we independently operating? Are we not independently operating? Making that like awfully clear so that everybody starts on the same page. That's my number one for must-haves.
So big emphasis on knowledge transfer, making sure there's some continuity of information as you shift from diligence to integration.
Yeah. So knowledge transfer, yes. I think about knowledge transfer in two ways, right? If you are in a situation where for some reason your diligence team gets separated from your integration team, right? The functional leads that are already embedded within the companies, they have to have a really detailed plan about how do they close that gap without reinventing diligence. The ideal is that you don't have to run through that process because you ensured that you have the right people engaged in diligence to begin with. And I think when we talk about that knowledge chasm, it's something that we do to ourselves by separating those two things for some reason, right? And creating the necessity for a handoff of all this information, which, by the way, you can never hand off cleanly. So the best way to do that is by having the right people engaged to begin with and using the people who are going to end up with the company in the end to really drive that line of questioning so they can consume the information that comes out of the soon to be acquired company.
How would you vision the ideal approach of when you get involved
As an integration leader? Yeah, so my best answer is as soon as possible. I'm usually involved in the pipelining as well, so I know what's out there, even if it's way out there. If that's not possible for some reason, bandwidth constraints, whatever it might be, LOI. As soon as an LOI goes out, that's when I really need to be there. And it's I've seen it displayed in a couple different ways, and you've probably got it in your handbook or soon to be other handbooks of kind of these parallel tracks, which I don't feel like tells the full story, right? It's that's parallel tracks to me still feels separate. To me, at LOI, a Sabeeh and a me are working very closely together, where Sabeeh might be out in front and I'm supporting behind, and we just kind of shift up. And it never gets to 100 and 0. It'll get to a 70-30, right? While Sabeeh is supporting through an integration and being there for maybe historical context. So I absolutely LOI. I got to be there, even if for some reason I fell asleep during the pipeline phase.
Sabeeh, you back?
I am back, hopefully. Got my start doing M&A, working for a software company based out of Fort Worth, Texas, moved on to a company based out of Virginia for about a year and a half, 2 years. And now I am with Syniti as a director of corporate strategy and development. Completed about 10 plus deals now. We're in the middle of one at the moment. So things are pretty interesting. I've done some cross-border deals, in Europe as well as in New Zealand. So I've got some exposure there as well. And almost all of my deal experience has been working with software or technology-based companies.
Great. So we kick things off with just a chat about process must-haves. And Aaron made an emphasis about really focusing on knowledge transfer to avoid a knowledge chasm as you shift from diligence to integration as much as possible, and sort of alluded to getting involved early in the process and watching this responsibility shift where it's primary corp dev, and then it starts increasing on his role as an integration lead. But love to get some of your thoughts in terms of what are some of the process must-haves.
Yeah, I mean, from the front end, and speaking from kind of the part before we get to that, and obviously, I think what Aaron hit upon is really critical, is making sure that knowledge transfer happens, and trying to figure out kind of when you're going to do that as well is a difficult decision at times. And I'll get to that in a second, but I would say kind of starting really early on, some process must-haves are just making sure that you've got regularly scheduled, internal meetings, external meetings with stakeholders, making sure that you're very clear with your communication, right? So I've got standing weekly call that I have with the seller and the advisor, just to talk through any sort of roadblocks, right? Making sure that we are on target in terms of timing, making sure that we are able to just kind of hit upon very high level all the things that we need to take care of in order for us to be able to close on time. And I think internally, one of the kind of the key must-haves is you got to have a weekly kind of leader meeting, if you will, with the owners of all of your various work streams, getting together, not necessarily going through the detail of every little thing, but just hitting upon, hey, what are the major red flags? What are the things that we need to take care of prior to closing? And so for me, like those two standing kind of weekly calls are really critical. And the objective also is to keep those fairly brief, right? You don't want them to drag on. So I try to keep the external call to 30 minutes or less. The internal call, maybe an hour, because you've got, so many different folks involved. But that to me is one of the most critical things. That, and, there's some other documentation as well that I like to have, but that's, for me, that focuses in on, like, as you're building a process kind of from the ground up, you want to make sure that you're consistent in how you are going through that and make sure that it's a repeatable process. And so one of the things that I do to facilitate that is create like a definitions document. If you're talking about pipeline and you're talking about the various phases that a deal goes through, being very explicit, very clear from the get-go, when something moves or what the trigger is to move from one stage to the next, and make sure that it's all kind of codified and written down so that if there are already questions later on, that you are consistent in applying labels, that you're consistent in your organization, that you're consistent in your communication. I think that there's so many moving parts when you're talking about M&A that you really, really have to be, have a consistent, repeatable process in place. So anything that can help you kind of do that, for me, it's documentation, but, I'm sure for other folks, they may have some other must-have stuff.
That's a really good point. It almost sounds like you're basically building like an operating model that defines how your company's approaching M&A and the thinking behind it almost.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's your guidebook, right? That's like what you are going to refer to anytime there's any sort of questions, anytime there's a disagreement between you and a certain team member. about any sort of topic, you can always refer back to that. It's like almost like a manual, like an employee handbook for M&A, where it's like, okay, this is what we're going to follow, and this is the cheat sheet. And you obviously want to make improvements to that as time goes on. Every time you go through a deal, when you're doing a postmortem, you're trying to figure out what went right, what went wrong. You would make changes. But having that documentation in place, I think, is a huge help.
Is that something you do, Aaron, or?
Yeah, so I have operated out of a playbook, right? Like a full kind of instruction manual. There are certain pieces that I'll lean on more heavily, and some of that is like ownership, like really trying to establish, use some tools over heavy documentation to establish ownership. And I think that's an area where you can see some disasters ensue, right? If you think about what Sabeeh's doing, there can be a tendency for that group that he's pulling together to fall into a pattern of Sabeeh's got that. He's doing the diligence. He's collecting all the information. He's just going to tell us when it's done. That's the chasm forming, right? Because the next thought behind that is, okay, we've got all the diligence. What's the plan, Sabeeh? Right? Or what's the plan, Aaron? I try to take the approach that a Sabeeh and myself are the two least important people in that process. Right, we're really just a tool for the company to collect the diligence and to really codify. I think Sabeeh called it the plan, but we're really just working for the smarter people in the company, right? And that trickles all the way down through go to market and all that. So that's really where I focus is some of the tools rather than having somebody go through and read a manual, right? Because I know where that goes. Having it is good to go back and refer to. Hey, here's what we talked about last time. But I'll rely on snippets as tools rather than a full kind of distribution of a handbook.
What about like people you pull in that may be brand new to M&A? Is that because I feel like it would be nice to have a briefing like Sabeeh described to get somebody up to speed about how our company thinks about M&A and the approach we take, where I feel like your approach may make a little bit more sense if somebody's already got a rhythm down.
There's so much that goes into it from an integration perspective that when you're standing that up or you have new functional leaders that are going to be engaged in this, given the whole thing, I think it's hard to digest. What I tend to lean on more is the objectives, right? If you have a smart enough leader, and anybody who shows up on our doorstep is a professional, right? You have to assume that. So if you can give them some of the operating principles of here's how we do it, here's how we think about it, maybe not step by step. Here's how we think about it, and here are the objectives. Here's what it should look like in the end. And then with nothing else, a professional should be able to think their way through some of the smaller details there. So rather than overload up front, I'll give some of the concepts. It maybe not heavily documented, but I'll present those concepts in a way that's easily consumable and then start feeding additionally as we kind of build that muscle.
To add a little moment of vulnerability here, what part of the process haven't you gotten right yet?
I think that varies depending on kind of where you are in terms of the company, in terms of the experience with M&A, right? So every time I go to a new company and essentially kind of start over, I think every company has their own gaps in kind of the M&A process, right? And so when you're building something from the ground up, it seems like there's a lot that you haven't gotten right, and then there's other places where you've been to where they're very experienced with M&A. They've done tons of deals. They've got a team in place that is consistently involved with both due diligence as well as integration, and then you have very different kind of things that you don't get right. I think one of the areas that we are probably struggling with a little bit at the moment right now is getting those processes in place for the integration and the handoff between between the front end of the deal from diligence and the back end of the deal, which is kind of the post-acquisition integration. So I think that that's one of the areas that we could certainly improve upon, and trying to find the right time to make that transition as well is can be challenging. So when you're working on the front of the deal, there's so many moving parts, and a deal could really fall apart realistically at any time, right? And so you also don't want to get the integration folks involved too early and waste their time because they've got a day job as well. And ideally, you have some sort of overlap between the diligence team and the integration team. But if you don't, then you've got to be able to figure out kind of what that trigger point is, and when you're going to read them in to the transaction. Give them the background, why we're doing the deal, what the value creation drivers are, and what's going to be critical in terms of the kind of day one activities to ensure that smooth transition. So finding that the right time to kind of begin the handoff, I think is challenging for sure.
Aaron?
Yeah, almost the same. So it's I have an internal battle that I fight with myself all the time around the integration kickoff. Ideally, I don't want to have to run an integration kickoff, because all of the individuals, professionals who are going to be running that integration in deals of the size that I typically work with should have already been engaged earlier on. If I have to run a separate, brand new team integration kickoff, it means that we just created that chasm, and now we're transferring knowledge over. We're teaching them about the thesis and what's the point. So I have an integration play that kickoff play that I run. Every time I do, I feel a little dirty about it, because it means I didn't get the guys in early enough, and now we've created that gap. So solving for that is something that I haven't fully gotten comfortable with, because, as Sabeeh mentioned, the timing and especially the level of professional that you may be working with, you may not be able to pull them fully into diligence or pre-close, because you could be, through one channel or another, putting that deal at risk. I'd rather have a kickoff meeting with a brand new team than put that deal at risk. But every time I do it eats at me a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can tell you, on the front end, we're certainly not trying to make your life that difficult.
That's definitely a tough one to crack. How do you ensure alignment with the target company post-close?
A lot of those conversations have to, you kind of have to have them early on during the diligence phase, actually. And when you're negotiating, I think, the purchase agreement, that's when you start to align certain incentives, right, to make sure that that the acquired company is going to be focusing on the right things on a go-forward basis. Start to have kind of those strategy sessions, I think, more so post-close, but you want to lay the groundwork for those discussions. I think earlier on there is a lot of conversation, a lot of back and forth that happens when you're talking about the deal thesis, and sometimes you can't necessarily obviously reveal all of that information on the front end and prior to closing, depending on the type of acquisition, depending on the circumstances. I mean, every deal is so different, but I think the more that you can do on the front end to clarify what the go-to-market strategy is going to be going forward, what the personnel plan is going to be, what's the timing of any sort of cost synergies that we're going to be focusing on, both from an operational perspective, I think, as well as from a technological perspective. I think that you kind of have to have those conversations super early on in the diligence phase, so that as you approach the end and as you approach that handoff to integration and you're crafting the communication documents, you're consistent with, and you're not kind of negotiating or having those those difficult conversations while you're in the middle of drafting an FAQ document for employees or anything like that. Like you want to make sure that everybody's clear. I also want to say that being the buyer in that situation kind of gives you a little bit more leverage because at the end of the day, like you're acquiring this company, it's going to be your business. Certainly, I think if you're planning on keeping the leadership team in place, they need to be involved. So you have a little bit of leverage there, but it still has to be a pretty collaborative process.
Kison, I hit that right at the top, right? That's my must-have. And Sabeeh's got the harder job there. This is maybe the one time that Sabeeh's got the harder job when it comes to work dev integration. But that conversation is, as he mentioned, is really an evolution, right? And there's some stuff that maybe he can't pull out up front as early as he would want to otherwise. So as that conversation evolves, as we get to that handoff pre-close to ensure that there's alignment there, that's where I'm working with Sabeeh to really punctuate and clarify that messaging so that right pre-close and immediately after close, we know that everybody is paddling the same direction. Hopefully, those tough conversations have been minimized just through Sabeeh's work. But if they haven't been, that's where we come together and really draw clear boxes around all the go-forward plans.
Transparency, really get the thinking about what integration is actually going to entail and evolve early so that there's clarity on it sooner than later and no big dramatic surprises.
Yeah. And sorry, just to add on that, I think, if there are certain clauses in the purchase agreement, right, that talk about some of those things, retaining key employees, things like that, I think that helps in making sure that objectives are aligned. Certainly, I don't think you're going to put anything in regards to like go-to-market strategy or anything like that in a purchase agreement. But the key there is understanding the motivations of the seller. Like, why are they selling this business? Was it a lifestyle business? Are their employees important to them? And then making sure that whatever plans that you have for the business are aligned with that as well. And having, again, if there's difficult conversations that need to be had, then I think you start to have them a little bit early on, at least set the stage for them. And then you start to kind of have them, the ones that could potentially blow up a deal. I think those conversations you have kind of post-close as opposed to prior.
An example of something like that?
I would say, I think from a personnel perspective, if the seller is motivated and wants to make sure that all of their employees, for example, are taken care of, that all those sales folks are going to be cared for, and you've got, or even their technology, their developers, and you've got plans to sunset their platform, or you're planning on phasing it out, and let's say you're taking out a competitor, for instance, then maybe you don't necessarily have that conversation prior to closing, right? In terms of like what your plans are for the developers, or what your plans are for their platform. Those are things where you would say, well, we're going to, post acquisition, we're going to take a close look at both product sets and figure out, which product makes more sense for our target markets and what our business strategy is, right? And so you kind of lay the groundwork beforehand and just let them know that it could be either or. It could be their platform or it could be yours that ends up getting retired. But I think that, if product and employees, for example, are really critical to them, then you don't have those the real meaty conversations around those until post acquisition, post close.
That's a good example. So really try to be as transparent as possible, but at times there is sensitivity where you got to make a tough call.
Absolutely, for sure.
How do we ensure team alignment during diligence?
You start with obviously a kickoff meeting. I like to have a diligence kickoff meeting kind of very early on, right as soon as we get the LOI signed and we're getting ready to start off within like the next 24 to 48 hours. Get a kind of an all hands call, everybody that's going to be involved from all the various work streams, give them the information on the deal, why we're looking at it, why it makes sense, what are some of the critical things that we're going to have to focus on. Again, mentioning the value creation drivers like is it a platform consolidation play? Is it a roll up? You know, do they have some additional functionality, or is it an acqui-hire where you're kind of bringing on employees? Like, what are the key things that we need to be focused on as we go through diligence? And then you put together a kind of a list of your diligence request list, right? And prioritize the ones that are most important. Make sure that each one of the work streams are focused in and keyed in on the things that are most critical for their work stream, and help kind of focus and drive the conversation a little bit, and identifying key issues, questions, risks that they need to keep an eye out for as they dig into the data room, as they go through the material. And then, what I alluded to earlier was kind of like the weekly check-in calls, right? So I like to have one kind of high level with the work stream owners every week to make sure that any sort of cross-functional or cross work stream items are being addressed. You don't want your operations team kind of operating in a silo from your finance team, and next thing you know, there is some sort of back-end billing issue that nobody had planned for or had, operations thought finance is going to take care of it, finance thought operations was going to take care of it, and then you've got a big mess in your hands. So definitely want to have, I think, those weekly leadership calls. And then also, depending on the size of your diligence team, you may also want to have smaller kind of, or maybe not smaller in the sense of time, but definitely have separate calls for each one of your individual work streams. So finance call, tech call, go-to-market call, etc. I think that that is a really great way to make sure that everything's being communicated, regularly with folks internally. And as you go through diligence, every week I'm pushing my team to update the tracker, make sure that folks are marking things off as complete. That is a signal to the seller that you're engaged, and that the team is kind of working through everything. And at the same time, I think it does a really good job of making sure that nothing slips through the cracks, that folks are engaged all the way through on your team as well, because they know that every time they come in for a weekly check-in call, they're going to have to show some progress. The tracker kind of helps facilitate that conversation. I don't know, Aaron, I would imagine it's probably very similar to kind of a project plan post-acquisition.
Yeah, it's almost carbon copy, right? And I didn't invent it. I just stole it from people smarter than myself, right? But it's the weekly functional check-ins, and then we all come together scaled agile style, usually on Fridays, to make sure that the cross-functional piece is there. So if you have that process in place during diligence, if you have that handoff in the middle, which ideally that handoff is as organic as it can be, rather than a start-stop kind of deal, it should just flow right through the whole next 90 to 100 days after that close, and it becomes more of a process, less than a singular string of events kind of approach.
We talked a little bit about when integration gets involved, and I think, Aaron, you basically came to conclude that it's as soon as LOI gets signed.
Yeah, it's I watched the pipeline, but then LOI, I'm right behind Sabeeh, supporting there however he needs it, so that we keep those parallel tracks. That's my preference, but again, earlier is better, almost in all cases.
Yeah, I would say a good rule of thumb is at least a few weeks before closing. You don't want any sort of surprises. It depends again on the timeline of the deal. If your deal timeline is 30 days or less, then you don't really have much of a window. But I think maybe one of the ways to get around that is to kind of constantly have a relationship with folks on the integration side, and let them know, hey, we're working on a deal, we're kicking off diligence. Can't share too much with you right now, but we may have another project for you coming up next month, something like that. And then obviously once you actually are kind of in the middle of diligence, as I said earlier, ideally those integration folks are involved with diligence, and so it is a clean handoff. And so, you don't, again, as Aaron said, you don't have to have a separate integration kickoff call per se. But again, in the event that you do, you want to do that sooner rather than later. So I would say at the absolute latest, maybe like 3 weeks before close would be kind of my sort of in my head, my internal deadline, where I gotta start involving some folks and letting them know what's coming.
What are the do's and don'ts of managing communication?
So big do for me, obviously, I probably said it several times already, is clarity and really underlining. Don't make assumptions that people know what the plan is, right? Or that somebody else has already shared with them. There's power in repetition. There's power in the cascade, right? So we've already talked about aligning with the leadership level. It should be the same message every single time as you cascade down through that organization. That message should tie out to what you share with the customers. It should tie out to what you share with the partners internally, with the the employees of the acquiring company, as well as the employees of the company that's coming into the family. So consistency, clarity. There's probably another C we could throw in there, but just being super crisp with all of that messaging, so that there's no little threads to pull at and you don't create that confusion. There's enough confusion as it is, right? Or the potential for confusion, that any thread of different messaging that goes out is thank you.
I would I think agree with all of that. I think you nailed it. You got to make sure that your communication plan is consistent again with your deal thesis, with that the seller is clear on what's going to be communicated to the customers, to the employees that are being acquired, and you also want to make sure that you are communicating appropriately again to your own employees as well. And I think the big do for me in terms of the day-to-day management of the team is, I try to start off every week or every conversation that I have with the assumption that missed last week. So I just kind of bring them up to speed on every little thing that happened in the last week, and kind of where we are today. And then I kind of hand it off to the workstream owners to say, now go ahead and fill us in on where we are with diligence. What are the risks that you discovered, that sort of thing. I don't necessarily go into the details of the IT team found X, Y, Z, but I'll say the IT team, went through diligence. They identified a number of risks that we need to discuss. We had a legal diligence call. We started drafting the stock purchase agreement, et cetera. So folks are aware of more than just their siloed functional, area in terms of where we are with the deal overall, where we are within the timeline, so that they can better manage and fill out their calendars over the coming weeks as well. If they know that they're going to be crunched or they're going to have a task with a dependency, then they need to be able to kind of manage their schedules accordingly. So for me, that's huge. Starting off every meeting as if nobody's in the loop and I'm just kind of filling them in for the first time in a week.
Can we talk about go-to-market strategy? When does that thinking come in place?
Super early on. I think that's a part of diligence. If you don't have a go-to-market strategy, you have no business closing, in my opinion. I think, I know that some people fall into that trap of figuring it out kind of after the fact, but I think you've got to at least have an idea in your head before you close, in terms of how you're going to price this new product that you're acquiring, or are you going to pursue a direct sales model or an indirect sales model? What are the cost structures associated with that? All of that is a key part of the valuation model that Corp Dev is building. So, that really, I think, can make or break a deal, and it's okay to I think be in a position where you're not entirely sure of maybe the nitty-gritty details, but you at least need to be able to identify what are the key things that we're going to have to figure out immediately post-close, right? So if the plan is to move forward, if you're acquiring another platform, maybe that's a direct competitor of one of your platforms. Okay, great. post acquisition, we're going to have a strategy session. We have to figure out, which one has the better brand recognition, what specific market segments are they targeting. And I think if you have the framework of the plan set in place, then those conversations post acquisition get to be a lot easier, because then you can quickly kind of make those calls within the first 30 days and start to execute against it. I think if you walk in thinking, well, we're not really sure, well, we'll figure out what we're going to do, post acquisition, that's messy. And more than likely you're going to miss your targets, and it's not going to be a successful acquisition.
That's also where the company that's new to the family starts getting hip to the fact that you don't have a plan, right?
Yes.
And your communication starts falling apart there. I think a mistake that can be made is mistaking a thesis for a go-to-market strategy. The thesis is great as an initial kind of conversation driver, but that go-to-market needs to get to the next level. And I think that's also a place where super clear ownership comes into play, right? In my world, and probably Sabeeh's world as well, that's product, right? Sabeeh can lead with a thesis, hey, this is interesting because, but that product team needs to be smarter than the both of us and really put together that framework. That framework drives everything else that I do post-close. And it should drive synergy planning. It should drive, to Sabeeh's point, that model build that we're going to put together. So without that go-to-market, we're toast. It takes forever to get through some of that stuff post-close. It can be a relatively painless process if you do it pre-close.
Sounds like you lived through it.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
How do you make sure that you have an executable go-to-market strategy on day 2?
It's really, I think, demonstrating that framework. There are some key pieces there, right? It's how does the product fit into the portfolio? Are we growing it? Are we holding it? Are we EOLing it? I can't do it. I'm not a product guy. But for the right professional in that product role, it should be a fairly simple exercise based on some of the findings that Sabeeh brings forward. Beyond that, some of the modeling that Sabeeh does is going to drive most of that as well. But just that framework gets me to enablement or clear kind of actionable go-to-market activities by day 2, ideally by that Monday after close.
I guess for you, Sabeeh, when we think about this handoff to integration team, I guess when are you done? When are you first visually out of here? Is it right when closed and you have your closing party and you disappear and you're on to the next one? Or
no, I certainly I don't necessarily believe that. I think it can obviously vary depending on the transaction, right? But my job is, at least in the front end of corp dev, is to obviously oversee diligence, but I still stay pretty involved especially in the immediate aftermath of an acquisition, to make sure that there is that knowledge transfer, to facilitate any difficult conversation that we need to have with a seller who is now a member of your organization, to kind of get those roadblocks out of the way so the integration team can go out and execute, right? And I think that my role shifts a little bit. So instead of, I think on the front end, a good way to describe it is you're actually a project manager, and then on the back end, once it kind of shifts into the integration phase, you're more of a program manager. And so your job is to make sure that the high level decisions are being made in a timely manner, that again, that the integration team can just go out and essentially execute. And I'll stay involved. I probably at most for about a year, kind of post close. My goal is to be completely done and out of there, within a year of post acquisition. Obviously, that timeline can vary. And as that year goes on, I'm probably less and less involved. I'm probably more heavily involved kind of post acquisition, and for like 2 or 3 months at most. And then I start to kind of fade out a little bit as the day-to-day integration process is continuing because it doesn't really require as much of my input, and there is already that knowledge transfer is already kind of largely complete.
What keeps you on the hook?
In terms of what keeps me on the hook later,
yeah, it keeps you incentivized to stay on. And
I mean, just being a member of the team, and just the fact that that I'm going to be held accountable for it. Right? It's not if the integration goes poorly, chances are folks are going to look at that acquisition as having been executed poorly. I look at it as even though I may not be directly responsible for it, it is still a reflection on me because I was responsible for making sure that the integration team could do their job effectively. So, and obviously, the success of the company means that it's good for all of us, right? So, it's just a personal stake. I definitely look at it as this is just as much my responsibility. I'm a member of the team, and I'm not here to make Aaron's job more difficult, right? And if the two of us are gelling, if we've got great communication, if the project's running smoothly, then chances are that both of us are going to be looked upon favorably, I think, by leadership.
We got a handful of questions before we hit the hour here. How about day one do's and don'ts?
Definitely have a plan prior to day one. So definitely don't walk into day one thinking, okay, now that the deal is closed, we're going to figure out, we're going to put together the project plan. We're going to, put together all of that. I think that's got to happen prior to close. And I would say don't necessarily make large organization changing decisions on day one. So if there is a plan to reduce headcount, for instance, that's not something that I necessarily want to do immediately post-close. I think one of the first things that I like to do is make sure that the new employees are being welcomed, that they feel a part of the new organization, that they know that we're all going to be there to support them. There's a lot of fear, I think, certainly, and I think some of the HR folks would probably attest to this. There's a lot of uncertainty, not just actually from employees, but also from customers as well, because they don't know what the plan is going forward. So the key is to have a good communication plan in place for both internal and external stakeholders. And I would kind of focus on the cultural kind of integration issues on day one. And then kind of start your technical integration whenever I think that it makes sense for the deal.
I'll say the same, but a little different. And just reduce uncertainty on day one in whatever form that takes. Also seems small, but it's not. The biggest hero on day one can be your internal IT guy or gal, just for setting up those email addresses. We find ourselves in situations where we may get into a spot where we're trying to bring in new employees and having to have that awful conversation of what's your availability Tuesday. If I can see somebody's calendar on day one, that greases the skids for us. So just reducing that uncertainty, that IT enablement can really go quite a ways there.
Give us your best advice. We've got an audience of folks that are either managing deals for their first time, involved in various parts, corp dev, integration. But I like it that you guys have a lot of this experience fresh in mind, have got your battle wounds and things like that. But what are some of the real key lessons that stick out to you that you think people should keep top of mind or could learn from you?
Go fast. Go fast. The faster it's you should get to a point where you're going so fast that it feels reckless. At that point, you're almost fast enough, right? That doesn't erase any of what we've talked about before, some of the best practices around not creating confusion, right? You still need that clarity, but you need to create that clarity fast. The longer you leave it sit kind of off on a shelf, the more you can get confusion percolating up and cultures don't gel, right? So go, whatever you're going to do, go fast. And that includes try to be done with anything you possibly can be done with before day one even hits.
For me, again, go fast, I think makes a lot of sense. Definitely don't delay or postpone or procrastinate in any way. If you've got, I think from a diligence perspective, you've got things to look at, dig in as soon as you can. And then I think the other thing is make sure that everybody is engaged and is consistently engaged. So if you are sending messages or you're just assuming that a particular work stream is kind of handling their business and they're capable and everything's going smoothly, I think that's a great mistake. I think that understanding that folks have a lot on their plate, they've got a day job as well, they've got other responsibilities, but making sure that they are checking their emails, that they're up to date on the latest developments with the transaction, I think is critical. Because the last thing that you want is to find out 3-4 weeks into diligence that one of your work streams really hasn't made as much progress as they needed to, and now that's going to kind of delay closing. So for sure, making sure that folks are regularly engaged, and if folks are not engaged, then you know what you got to do in order to make sure that they get engaged quickly, whether that involves involving senior leadership, or some other way of ensuring that. I think that's key.
I just saw a comment about touching on sourcing, since most of our conversation has been on diligence integration. But hey, Sabeeh, that's sort of your department. You got any thoughts or tips around managing sourcing?
Yeah, I would say make sure that you are using some sort of tools other than just Excel. I think Excel is a good resource if especially as you're kind of keeping a running tab of all of your potential acquisitions or prospects that are out there. But having a kind of a CRM-like tool, a pipeline management tool, is key. Even if it's not a deal that you necessarily want to pursue today, having the intelligence and having the data on that is extremely helpful and critical. And then invest in the tools that are going to help you find more deals. There's not a ton out there, but certainly tools like PitchBook and CapIQ can help with the deal sourcing bit, trying to find other companies that are in that space. Google is my biggest friend. I love, kind of disappearing down a rabbit hole. If I look at one company and try to figure out who all their competitors are and what space they play in, and look at, because my background is software, I'll look at like websites like Capterra and then Software Advice and figure out who else is in that space. And you can really start to kind of catalog all of the companies that you think might be remotely kind of in the wheelhouse, either from an acquisition perspective, I think, or as a potential acquirer for you down the road, right? Corp Dev's job is not just finding deals, but also, prepping the company that you work for an eventual, exit or sale as well. And so, our job is market intelligence as well as just deal sourcing. So, I mean, for me, we've tried other products as well in the past that supposedly help with deal sourcing. I have not had a ton of luck with them. A lot of them are kind of centered around investment bankers and, and lenders really, and trying to help companies find financing. But from a strategic M&A perspective, I think that there's nothing better than start with a Google search and disappear down the hole and see where it takes you.
Get into your industry conference.
That too, yes. Industry conferences are certainly, I think, key and helpful. But in the COVID world, for instance, where that sort of thing may be a little bit more difficult, internet searches are your best friend, and a good starting point for sure.
Gentlemen, Aaron and Sabeeh, thank you so much for your time today. I know both of you have courses you recently added to the M&A Science Academy. I highly encourage those to check it out. Sabeeh wrote one around managing the diligence process. I think you covered sourcing in there as well. And then also Aaron has a course around managing integration. Both great series. So highly recommend checking them out. I know we touched on a little bit from a variety of different topics with this.